kick off if that's good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Future Talent Learning webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by Stephen Isherwood, the Joint Chief Executive of the Institute of Student Employers, used to be the Association of Graduate Recruiters. And we're going to have a conversation today and share some information and insights on the theme of funding future skills for early years with the apprenticeship levy. So how can we do that? And some of the aims of today are understand the levy funding and eligibility, uh, meet and match the demand for future skills. How do you build a business case to roll out and deliver apprenticeship training programs? And also looking at this, setting them up for success. What does that look like so that you're putting a lot of time and effort in and it can be set up sustainably? So we've got an hour in the diary. We'd like to give kind of 10, 15 minutes back to you in the hour. So if we run till about 10:45, 10:50, the format is going to be Stephen is going to speak and share some slides in a few minutes. And then I'm going to do the same. We're going to use the chat function. So by all means, put any questions as we go into the chat function, and we'll both keep an eye on that. And we'll either kind of pick them up as we go, or actually what we'll have is a kind of hopefully a really interactive discussion based on your questions at the end of what we've presented. So I hope that makes sense to you all. Stephen, really great to be joined by you, and I know how much apprenticeships have become an important part of all considerations from early years. And in fact, we were just discussing about having a chat about changes in the apprenticeship landscape just this morning. But I'll hand over to yourself, and it'd be great if you might, explain why this is important to yourself, and then look forward to your insights.
Yeah, we'll do. Thanks, Jim. Yes, and thanks for inviting me to join you on this session. It is quite apt, isn't it, that we're talking about this on the very day that the long-awaited Level 7 announcement has come through. It's also interesting, you reminded me that we used to be called the AGR, the Association of Graduate Recruiters, till 2018. And I guess that's we changed the name. We didn't do it because we were chasing after a rebrand. It's because the market had changed. My previous life in corporate life, was mostly around graduates. And just before I joined the ISE, places where I used to work, like the Big Four, was starting to embrace apprenticeships now, and it's a really big part of what we do. And I think it's going to change again, and that's hopefully what I want to do, is just set a bit of scene setting. Before handing back to you, Jim. So if I just share my screen, there we go. It's interesting, this other sort of, it's quite interesting listening to language, because as language changes, it tends to denote sort of shifts in the market and what we do in our practices. And this phrase emerging talent seems to be coming through as actually the phrase lots of organizations are using to describe early careers. I'd like to think that I created it. We were talking about future of early careers, future talent. It's interesting that it ties into some of the work you've done on your brand, Jim. But we picked up from quite a few employers, they're talking about this thing called emerging talent. And it's because, as I'll explain shortly, we think this focus on purely just graduates and school leavers will start to blur again, and that actually this definition of having sort of really prescribed entry routes defined by age and an education exit point is going to become a bit more blurred. So I want to talk a little bit of background to that, then bring it back to the apprentice levy as we go through. So if anybody's heard me talk about this over the last sort of 12 months or so, they'll have heard me talk about things like demographics, skills. So I just want to reinforce what we think the two big forces are driving this change, because we don't think that a lot of this change is coming from necessarily just a change in mood, or necessarily something that's a bit sort of, I guess, fashionable and might go out of fashion in a couple of years or so, which you do sometimes see with some of the trends around organizational behavior and organizational management. The first big shift that's happening is demographics. The UK has a declining birth rate. If it wasn't actually for immigration, the population would be starting to shrink in size, and that's because fewer people are being born, and that's something that we don't often talk about, I don't think. We talk a lot about an aging population, so people staying in work longer, people living longer, but actually there are also fewer people being born. So that's changing the shift of the population. So if you look at the left-hand side of that slide, there are now fewer 15 to 19-year-olds than there are 55 to 59-year-olds. And that change is only going to get exacerbated. I think in about 5 years' time, we'll start to see that long-term decline in 18-year-olds coming out of the education system really kick in. So that's happening. That's one of those immovable forces, and that's going to change the nature. If you think about the shape of education routes, the shape of training routes, but that's the shape of the employed population. You can think how that's changed an awful lot from when it used to be actually a pyramid with lots of sort of younger people coming in at the bottom. So that's the demographics piece. The other piece that's changing is the nature of skilled roles within the economy, and that's the image you've got on the right-hand side. I won't talk through it in detail, but basically the net change in roles where there's a big spike is in actually more highly skilled roles. Now we could get into a conversation around, is that, sort of level 7 degree level, postgraduate degree? Is it more level 4, not quite degree level? There's lots of conversation about that, but there's no doubt that the actual jobs in the economy are becoming more skilled. Lower skilled work, actually, the number of jobs in the economy is relatively flat, it's relatively stable. It has been for the last 15 years, and is still predicted to be for the next sort of 10 to 15 years at least. We still need human beings to work in the service sector, in the care sector. There's an argument that some of those jobs may shift, but the actual number of jobs will stay the same. But it's in those more highly skilled roles that's where employer growth is growing. And then if we look at the data around actually what are the kind of skills that people do have of working age population, this is analysis done by qualification level. But if we use that as a proxy for skills, again, I won't dissect this quite busy slide in a huge amount of detail. But basically, the green bar is the current population skills education level. The orange bar is prediction to 2035. The blue bar is 2025 current situation. And actually, what you can see is that overall, the UK is underqualified. Yes, there is a lot of conversation about our graduates overqualified, and there is some of that in the economy, but that is far outweighed by the number of people who aren't qualified, who aren't trained enough for the level of work we're doing. So you've got those two forces. You've got demographic change, and you've got higher skills needs in the economy. And then we're starting to see that drive a lot of employer behaviour, but also government policy. Because actually, when you look at what's underpinning some of the drivers of government policy, it's driven by those factors. And that, of course, impacts the skills that employers need. So I'm not going to go into huge detail on AI. That's a whole other topic in itself. But obviously, as AI is changing the nature of the work that we do or are predicted to do. I read somewhere recently that the average shelf life of technical IT skills is about 2 years before everything needs to change again. So actually, there's lots of evidence that actually those longer term, more structured kind of thinking about roles and the technical skills of jobs, that's becoming much shorter and much higher turnover, which we believe actually is going to increase that focus on actually the kind of skills that enable you to learn, to adapt, to problem solve, to think creatively. That's where the skills need is going to be, and actually the focus on the more technical skills will become more shorter form, and something that employers will need to develop sort of more rapidly on the go, as it were. And this isn't ISE data. This is the World Economic Forum. On the left hand side, it will show you the core skills that are important to employers, and again, that's those kind of analytical thinking, resilience, motivation, self-awareness, curiosity, lifelong learning, those kind of skills that enable that kind of approach to work. On the right-hand side is actually where employers are saying they can see the skills need increasing up to 2035, and that's where you can see AI and big data really kicking in. But also you can see on there as well, still very much that curiosity, approach to lifelong learning, and that resilience, flexibility. I sometimes think those words are a bit misused or a bit understood, or they're a proxy for something else. But we think it's very much that ability to deal with the changing nature of work. And of course, here at the IC, we just launched it a couple of weeks ago. Our development survey, an annual survey in terms of how development programs are run. And one of the things we ask in that every year is all about skills and tracking the skills that employers are focusing their development programs on. And here we've got it broken down by graduates and school leavers. And you can see there is some difference in where the focus lies with employers, and that's to be expected, school leavers and college leavers. I mean, we use that term because there are some programs that aren't driven by the apprentice levy, but it really is a proxy for those kind of apprentice levy programs delivered at school college age. And it is in that sort of soft skills space, but with the school and college leavers, it tends to be more focus on actually those skills getting people work ready, because actually somebody that is, as you'd expect, probably has a bit less work experience. Whereas graduates, I guess it's a slightly higher level in terms of those behavioral, cognitive type skills. But the message is the same: is that those kind of skills, those behavioral skills, cognitive skills, are really important to employers. That's where they're putting the focus, and that's where they're actually spending their training budgets. So all those movements, we think, we brought out a report earlier this year, which again you can access online. It's how early careers is moving to emerging talents, and this whole idea of the skills-based organizations and how employers look at skills and how they deliver their training. We think there are some long-term shifts that are happening in the market. We think employers to a certain extent are protected from this a little bit at the moment, because we are in a fairly tough economic situation at the moment. There isn't a huge amount of growth in jobs, but if we think back to 2002, post-pandemic, when there was a lot of growth in the economy, and actually that employer shortage bit very quickly, we think the same is likely to happen. So employers tell us they're looking at actually these emerging talent strategies, putting skills more at the core of how they hire and develop people, embedding skills more into that student experience. How do they work with universities, colleges, schools to increase those awareness of those skills? We're hearing lots of employers talking a lot more around strategic workforce planning. So actually really trying to think in the longer term, talking about those forces I started. So it's not just about operationally how do you deploy people, but how do you build a workforce plan or a hiring and development strategy that takes into account those kind of demographic changes. And of course, all this means that actually HR needs to be much more integrated in terms of how it manages people, how it develops people, how it retains people, reskills and upskills them. And of course, technology is going to play a big part of that. And I'm sure that's something you'll talk about as well, Jim. And also, we're starting to see, I have been around a little bit, and I remember when career management used to be part of some of the organizations I worked at. I don't mean just sort of career coaching type, but actual, being able to have a resource where you can talk about careers, the best way to manage your careers. We're seeing that now being built back into development programs, actually a specific skill. How do you manage your career? How do you thinking about your career? Most employers tell us that actually this is the stuff they're thinking about, they're trying to grapple with. There's a whole other conversation we could have around how difficult that is to do. It sounds, great and easy on a slide, but actually implementing some of this is really tricky. And we did a survey last year and asked employers where they're at on this journey, and roughly 60% said they were either starting to do it or knew they had to, but were really just very much at the early stages. Very few employers told us they'd actually fully adopted these kind of approaches, and a very small percentage said no, we're not interested in this. So it's very much an emerging piece of work. And we are starting to see some signs in the marketplace. I don't want to resort to the kind of tabloid headlines we see around graduates, non-graduate roles, because I think there's quite a lot of misinformation out there. But we are hearing employers talking about roles that maybe aren't necessarily badged as a purely graduate role. You don't need a degree to do that role. It might be that it's mostly graduates who take those roles, but actually programs being less defined by academics. And I think this data that the IC has is really quite interesting on this. Now, some of this is driven by approaches to diversity, so being more open, having few barriers to entry. But I think it's also recognizing that actually there's qualification point as a demarcation point for, you know, can you or can't you apply to a role is shrinking. The interesting bit in that is the A-level piece. The UCAS tariff, 10 years ago, roughly 40% of employers were stipulating a UCAS tariff, where now it's hovering around about the 10%. Interesting, I've been asked a few times recently by universities around actually how much employers value a postgraduate qualification. Less than 10% of IEC members say they want somebody have a postgraduate qualification on hiring. So that's something we're going to continue to track. So if qualifications actually become less significant in the jobs market, what is important? And this is where we talk about skills. And I think there's also a body of work out there that talks about the need to really create scaffolding around skills. People stay in education longer, they have less work experience coming through, so that we've got to really think about how we build that scaffolding into the education system. But also, as AI changes the way we learn, the way we do our jobs, that's going to disrupt actually the kind of relationships that we have at work, whether you learn at desk, how you learn from somebody you're working with. If there are fewer kind of roles for people to move through and in a kind of a step ladder kind of way through their jobs, actually there's going to be less there's less automatic structures in there for how we learn. So I think we do have to think quite a lot around how that learning is structured, which is actually where the apprentice levy comes into play. Obviously, we have lots of conversation around the technicalities of the levy, how it works. There's the politics side of it that gets a lot of airtime. But again, if we think back to the genesis of things like the apprentice levy, things like the lifelong learning entitlement, why governments are looking at these, it is to try and address the skills needs of the economy. So a couple of bits of data that we have from the IC in terms of actually how employers are using those apprenticeships. It is different sector to sector. Again, one of the things I think that I'm definitely guilty of doing this is very much generalizing about this jobs market, thinking that, this, whether it's graduates or apprenticeships role, there is a very different jobs market. The route to become a medic, to become finance professional, to a lawyer, a marketeer are all quite different. So we see very different rates of levy spend, actually from employer to employer, and views to how the levy is used and how the levy might be changed, how it's used. Again, I won't go through this in detail. It's a bit of a busy slide, but it's from our latest development survey. I thought I'd include it this morning because it told us what employers thought about the proposed changes coming through. I think we'll ask this question again in the next couple of months or so and see if it changes. And this was employers' view on the government's proposed changes, and you can see very different opinions sector to sector. The red and purpley pink bars, that's where employer sectors are broadly supportive, either highly supportive or broadly supportive. So you can see areas like retail, built environments, pretty much, half or most are supportive. Actually, the red bar is not sure. Or the green bar is highly unsupportive, and you can see their legal finance sector actually much more cautious around what the government might be promoting. So I think it's going to be quite interesting seeing how the apprentice levy does change and reshape again how employers approach this emerging talent piece, which I think is quite a good segue into what you're going to talk about, Jim. Just a couple of links there. So there's emerging talent reports are on the IC website if you want to have a look at them. Or if you want to get in touch with myself at the IC team or Claire, who's our head of insights, we're more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Stephen. That's terrific. We will share the slides for both Stephen's presentation and the slides that I'm going to present with everybody after this webinar. So you've got those to look at the data in a bit more detail. Really, I've got a whole bunch of questions I want to ask you, Stephen, about that. But I'll cover my stuff and we'll come back to that. But please, if anybody's just joined, do pop any questions into the chat. I'm going to run through some information now. So I'll just share my screen. So Just by way of introduction, I appreciate at the top of this, I didn't fully introduce myself. So I'm Jim Carrick-Birtwell, and I'm the founder and chief executive of Future Talent Learning. And we've worked very closely with the ISE, or the AGR as it was before, for many, many years. So what I want to start with is just depending on where we all are, a couple of times, what is the apprenticeship levy? Well, it's a big chunk of change, which essentially has been mandated on particularly, mid and large employers. If you've got an annual payroll of over 3 million, then 0.5% of that is a levy, which goes into a pot, and you can spend it on regulated apprenticeships. But if you don't spend it, it goes back to the Treasury. And actually, Stephen was talking about that. It was introduced as a means of driving UK productivity, which is pretty poor. So it was a real financial incentive. The idea of this webinar is not to cover all of the kind of compliance issues in terms of how to use the levy, but I thought I'd just cover a few very basic points, depending on where people are in their consideration of, could apprenticeships be a means to upskilling? So time commitment is a really big consideration. There's a rule which is 20% off the job hours, which a lot of employers we know, even that know a fair bit about apprenticeships, remain confused about. What that means is that every learner has to have a chunk of time that they complete their learning within their working hours. What's important to say is that time is spread across the whole program. It should, with training providers, include kind of 5 weeks holiday. But the most important part is, for example, the leadership and management apprenticeships that we deliver. If there's 6.5 hours a week, there's roughly a third of that, which is learners applying what they've learned to things they're already doing in their day job. So that's really important. And whichever apprenticeships you're considering, when you're working with a training provider, it's really important to understand not just the headline 20%, and not just the calculation of what that means, which has been reduced recently to a minimum of 6 hours, but actually how much of that time will a learner be applying what they've learned in their day job, and how much time do they need to ring fence? And good practice is to get learners to set aside chunks of time that are diarized for their learning. It's either a particular day or chunks of a day. Functional skills. There's been some big changes to that recently. So functional skills was the requirement that if a learner doing an apprenticeship hadn't got a GCSE at C grade in maths and or English, then alongside the apprenticeship, they had to complete a GCSE in maths or English to get up to a C grade. That requirement has now been removed, and that's hugely helpful actually across the apprenticeship landscape. It doesn't mean it's not still an option. So if an employer wants any of their learners that haven't got that to do it, then the training provider has to provide that. Equally, if the employer says, well, we'll leave it up to the employee has the option to do that. Now, there is an additional requirement to provide additional learning support, and better training providers will be really inclusive. And I have to say, Future Talent Learning, we've taken accessibility to heart. And it's worth asking training providers about their approach to neurodiversity. What are they doing? What reasonable adjustments are they making across the program to support all learners doing an apprenticeship? And then eligibility requirements. There are several, but the top and bottom of it is that the apprenticeship funding can only be applied to learners based at least 50% of the time in England. They have to be UK citizens or citizens for the last 3 years of the European Economic Area. But it applies to learners in England is the key punchline. And other learners can do the program, for example, if they're in Scotland, Wales, or devolved nations, or international, but you have to commercially fund those. Now, options if you exceed your levy pot, which isn't often the case, but does happen. Not that many employers know that if you exceed your levy pot, then the government will fund any additional apprentices. They'll pay 95%. So, for example, our level 3 leadership and management program, the funding band is £5,000. That's used by employers for their graduate program. If they've exhausted their levy pot, they only have to pay £250 per learner. Now, another option, if you can't spend all of your levy, as I said, it goes back to the Treasury. Alternatively, you can gift or transfer unspent levy to other employers. Those might be, if you're a private sector employer, third sector employers. It could be not-for-profit organizations. And actually, we work with lots of employers to help them with that levy transfer. Just some principles about what does a modern apprenticeship learning program, what do good ones look like? And these are across lots and lots of standards. Well, I guess to start with, they provide structure and support. The learning pedagogy, which is 70-20-10 rule, and actually that relates almost exactly to modern apprenticeships. So what that translates as, the 70% is job-related experiences, which is putting into practice, applying what you've learned in your day job. And that's connected to apprenticeships as vocational qualifications. So yes, you will learn theories and models, but they are not entirely or specifically academic learning. The 70% is putting it into practice. 20% is structured support coming from social interactions. So on an apprenticeship program, to give an example from our leadership and management apprenticeships, that would include one-to-one coaching. That's a huge benefit to future talent, emerging talent, your entry-level learners. Very few senior, whether they're chief execs or managers, get regular one-to-one coaching. So that always worth checking that out, how much support is provided. It's also really important to provide support for line managers of apprentices or learners on the program. It's one of the biggest determinants of success, how much a line manager's being supported. In fact, it was a big theme, Stephen, of your recent development conference. Big conversation around upskilling and providing support to line managers and CPD for them as well. And the 10% of the 70-20-10 is the formal training or the structured course. And that's exactly what regulated apprenticeships provide across many, many standards, whether those are digital, technical, or human skills, leadership and management apprenticeships. Applied learning, I've touched on that, the 70%. The idea is to particularly with a lot of these transferable skills. Stephen was saying that a lot of the research from the World Economic Forum and indeed from employers is there's a premium on transferable human skills. And those behavioral skills can't be learned theoretically. It's only when you start practicing them, and that's where the continuous learning comes in. Practice, practice, practice. Do those new skills become embedded? And continuous learning is also what millennials particularly want. There's a great book, which I seem to reference I should have a kind of a share in the 100-year life. I reference it everywhere, but it is a great bit of research from Andrew Scott and Linda Grattan, looking at 20-somethings broadly that come through the doors of London Business School. And those people consistently rate a demand for continuous learning, and that employers are providing that as the number one thing that they're looking for. And modern apprenticeships provide that. Personalization, I've touched on coaching. Apprenticeships, Ofsted looks at apprenticeships that can be modular. And what the benefit of that when you're talking to a training provider is that what you want is to be able to allow a learner to jig the order around, so that if they happen to be doing a project that's relevant to a part of their curriculum, ideally they want to be able to pull forward that element of the curriculum so they can learn while they have the opportunity to practice it. AI enabled, it feels to me that AI is the promise of hyper-personalized learning in all education. We've fully embraced AI platforms as a way of learners accessing the curriculum in a hyper-personalized way. And again, I would say that whichever training provision you're looking at, whichever standards, we only deal with leadership and management apprenticeships. I would question training providers about their approach to AI and how they're embedding tools and platforms into the curriculum, because it allows learners to become very fluent in terms of digital fluency and AI fluency while they're learning. And experiential, finally, this idea of bringing to life or simulating behaviors and mindsets that employers are looking for. And that's right at the top of the list in terms of what learning professionals say good learning looks like. And we've embedded that within our learning provision for apprenticeships. But again, experiential learning should be one of the top things that you're looking for in apprenticeships. Now, moving on to setting up apprenticeship programs, what does success look like? So here's some strategic tips. And this is going to flow into the next part I'm going to present quickly in terms of creating a business case. So number one, just because you've got the levy, even if you're not spending it, that per se is not a good reason to start doing apprenticeships. The reason for that is the amount of time it takes for an employer to set them up for success, let alone the time it takes for your learners to successfully do an apprenticeship. So actually, if you're not going to set them up in a sustainable, strategic way, but just as a transactional to use the levy, they'll almost certainly be a poor return on investment. However, if you do set them up strategically, then important elements are align it with your talent strategy. We are talking to lots of C-suite professionals, including chief execs, who are saying what we most need to do, we've upgraded our operating system. We need to upgrade our human operating system. And actually, that's getting translated by heads of talent into how are we creating the right skills within our organization, whatever we're doing, to align with the business strategy, whether that's to be more agile, more competitive, more creative, more commercial, whatever the business performance criteria are, align your apprenticeship outcomes with that. And that will help you in terms of your investment. And then in terms of from the top down, I've touched on that. If you're going to set these up for success, then rather than acting as a head of early years, head of emerging talent, head of apprenticeships, working in isolation, if you can make sure that whatever you're aiming to deliver is part of a planned execution strategy for what the business needs as a sustainable skill strategy to drive your business performance and productivity, it's much more likely to not only succeed, but for you to get the right support that you need. So I'm actually going to run through the business case for setting up apprenticeships. And we get asked by employers to help them with this a lot. So again, happy to share these slides, but I'm going to just look at the demand side. So very, very quickly, you'll all be aware of there are some huge macro workforce trends going on at the minute. Automation and technology, digitization, and just the sheer speed of change going on. If you look at it from the C-suite, from CEO perspectives, this is PwC's annual global survey of chief execs. This is the 2024 data. 45% of CEOs recognize that they need to fundamentally alter the trajectory of their business over the next decade. And skills is a big part of that. So when it says 69% believe that generative AI will impact the workforce, that doesn't mean that they think that AI skills are the sole requirement. It's actually that they need to look and develop skills in a different way. And that's backed up by a lot of other data and research. I'm not going to dwell on this, but CEOs recognizing that not having the right skills is the number one risk to their business from a competitive point of view, and indeed existentially survival point of view. 54% of employees requiring upskilling. Again, we're in the foothills of that. We are nowhere near that level of commitment to upskilling in the UK or anywhere else for that matter. Stephen touched on the competitive landscape at the minute. Because growth is subdued, we're not feeling that. But a lot of organizations are anticipating 68% that talent competition is going to be important and skills are going to be part of that. Interestingly, 76% of organizations are utilizing on-the-job training to close that skills gap. So there does seem to be a recognition that that needs to be part of everybody's continuous, the continuous learning needs to be part of their day-to-day job. Again, on the demand side, this is what employees also want. McKinsey data, 42% of millennials are likely to leave because they're not learning enough. So what are the skills that employees want most? It feels that a lot of the research points to this bifurcation, this split between AI skills and human skills. They were called soft skills, but there seems to be an increasing focus on calling collectively those transferable skills human skills. And actually, as paradoxically, as AI takes over more tasks and creates more efficiencies, and as Stephen said, a lot of the technical aspects, employers recognize we can achieve these in shorter sprints, and the technical components of a lot of roles will keep changing. But actually, the evergreen skills are those human skills which are becoming much, much more important to provide the skills that are in demand now and in demand in the future. Again, not dwelling on this, Stephen covered this, but a significant proportion of the skills in demand now and in the future are the analytical thinking, creative thinking, human skills, resilience, agility, curiosity, self-awareness and empathy. And actually, we've broken those down in terms of the apprenticeship programs that we deliver that are relevant to emerging talent and to managers up to senior managers. We call it our transformational leadership program. This is how we've broken down three core, if you like, families of human skills that are in demand. So personal skills, broadly speaking, emotional intelligence, that agility that everybody is requiring. Interpersonal skills, collaborative, essentially relationship skills to support all the interactions that people have with others, other stakeholders in the business and outside the business. And then cognitive skills or entrepreneurial skills. We've got an acronym ACE, Agile, Collaborative, Entrepreneurial. Um, and again, this is very much mapped to what the skills that are covered if you were doing an MBA. So we kind of tag our uh, uh, management apprenticeships as mini MBAs. And again, happy to share this slide, but we've mapped the most in-demand skills, um, human, but also some of those harder business skills into language and tasks that are readily understandable, not just to learners, but to employers, so that you can get buy-in further up the food chain, so that actually, if you were talking to a CFO, to a head of talent, to a chief people officer, or indeed a chief exec, these tasks, stripped actually of HR language, are things that the business recognizes as these will drive our business performance. If you can deliver this human performance to drive our business performance, we will back that. What do you need? And the good news is the funding's already there, but you're then able to release the time commitment and the stakeholder buy-in to support and set up a sustainable program. Again, we've structured the program around specific tasks. So across 12 months, which is the length of the program, there are 12 tasks, the ones I was covering on the previous slide. 12 learning events, live experiential learning to bring those behaviors to life. Study groups between learners from lots of different organizations, or some employers just want colleagues within their organizations to come together, again, to network and share their insights and challenges. And that releases a lot of the social capital across businesses. Tripartite reviews, bringing learners and line managers and their coaches together, again, critical to make sure that line managers feel they have agency and they understand the requirements that their learners have. In our experience, a lot of line managers feel slightly alienated because they don't know how to support. And lots of one-to-one support throughout the program. So in conclusion, key ingredients for setting up a winning future talent program: apprenticeships are fully funded and they create a structured learning program. They provide opportunities for learning to be embedded in the flow of work. And apprenticeships can provide a fully funded way of delivering the most in-demand skills that both employers and employees are craving. So I'm going to stop sharing there. Stephen, I haven't been keeping track of the chat. I'm not sure if there's any questions that occur to you or that we can cover in the chat. If we spend sort of 5-10 minutes having a natter about this and covering any questions, what are your thoughts and reflections, Stephen?
Yeah, there are a few questions in the chat. The and it's quite interesting to think, kind of just over the last 10 to 12 years, how much the apprentice levy has evolved and how employers are using it. It was interesting that bit you mentioned towards the end, barriers, because I saw one of the questions come through, asking about what are the barriers to people using more of their levy. And I think some of it is that we hear from our members is around the complexity of the levy, around, I hesitate to use the word bureaucracy, but that kind of element that I think for some organisation it feels too complex. Whereas some employers I know just treat it as a payroll tax effectively. Then I think there's also, and you alluded to this as well, that but you were just saying about managers and support, which is that particularly when it comes to those who are maybe leaving school or college, which is that the managers are they're nervous about managing people with so little experience or so much younger, and that yes, a graduate might still be relatively inexperienced, but they've probably left home. They've got 2 or 3 more years life experience, so maybe there's a bit less of a leap to managing those populations, particularly when organizations are used to managing those kind of that age group.
Mm,
So yeah, I don't know if you come across that as well, but those are some of those kind of barriers that we see. But I think the more apprenticeships get embodied in working practices, the more that organizations seem to be overcoming some of those ways of thinking. I mean, if I go back, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the legal sector just wasn't really interested in apprenticeships at
mm,
all. Whereas I know
mm.
part of that's driven by SQE and regulatory changes, but you know, law firms could still just totally ignore the apprentice level if they want to, whereas they seem to be embracing it much more than they used to, which I think is quite a good example of where the apprenticeships are being used in sectors they weren't before.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Just building on what you've said in terms of an obvious barrier to apprenticeships, in our experience, is if in professional services, if you've got chargeable hours, whether you're an accountant, a lawyer, etc., it's a challenge to have learners doing an apprenticeship if there are chargeable hours involved, unless it's put in right at the start as part of their core training. So there are we were talking about ACA or other qualifications which can be delivered through an apprenticeship, and then that's the case. What we do find, however, is that a lot of professional services are really starting to look at and embrace the levy for back office roles, of which there are a myriad, as we all know. I think it feels to me that the school leaver cohort is more of a challenge in terms of looking at the almost the boot camp to get the sort of the basic skills in place, the hygiene factors for them for those school leavers to be able to navigate their way around the workplace before they even start learning. Um, and there was some great information at your development conference, Stephen, about the differences between an educational environment and an employer environment. And one of the key things is that in an educational environment, actually everything is very structured. When you hand in your work, how it gets marked, what the exams are, it's highly structured. You come into the workplace, and generally everything is set by your line manager. It's far less rigorous and less structured. So actually, the structure of apprenticeship programs, uh, uh, we recognize employers are increasingly turning to them, thinking, do you know what? To help smooth that transition from education to employment, we can't set up that structured program. But if we can embed a program uh, as our emerging talent or future talent program, then that can do a lot of heavy lifting for us. There was a question in the chat about can it be customized? And we certainly highly customize both the naming convention. We work with ASOS, and they would have they call it their greatness program when people are coming onto the level 3 program. Actually, the badging of it, what it looks like, there are very few restrictions on that. So you can make, as an employer, an apprenticeship program feel essentially highly custom and personalized to yourself. There's a question about Skills England, Stephen. Any thoughts on that?
I think most of us just don't know what's happening with Skills England yet. It's I think I read today that the board is going to be announced very soon, because they've appointed the senior positions. I hear kind of differing. Well, a lot of it is still unknown. The nervousness I hear, I've heard it from two different angles. One from the employer side, that actually because there is less of a requirement that actually um, employers have to effectively, agree or sign off things, and ministers can be more involved now. There's a nervousness that it might shift away from being as employer focused as it has been in the past, which I think might come from a nervousness we see apprenticeships being created where there might not be the labour market need. Then I'm a college governor, and the college governors that I've sat, the college I sit on, and the principal there says, well, actually, there needs to be a bit more flexibility in that FE college space around what the levy could do. And
Mm,
yeah, we were talking about, levy being used in that foundation level to be
yeah.
that bridge into work. So I, the long and the short of it is, I think we're just gonna have to see how it plays out. I think if it can use a lot more labour market data, if we can get this piece where actually it goes to more localised rather than being controlled by the centre, so actually local skills needs, I think that's going to be quite interesting. But I think we're going to have to wait and see. I don't know if you've heard any
Yeah.
different, Jim.
Well, no, we've when the Labour government was elected, there'd been a lot of kind of foreshadowing of Skills England. It wasn't a surprise, and I think the surprise was that a lot of employers expected Labour to come in with a much more clearly formed plan of what Skills England's mandate to deliver and do would be. And what we saw was quite a number of employers actually put what they were going to do with apprenticeships on hold for a few months while they waited for announcements. They've actually parked Skills England and realised, to your point, it's going to be a much longer term evolution. Um, and all of the kind of focus groups and stakeholder groups that I've been involved in, to your point, are around employers want their voice to be heard. Which again, if you look at first principles, the apprenticeship levy and indeed Skills England has been mooted to drive productivity and to create the skills that are required that employers know they need. So it would be obtuse if employers are not involved in that. I think employers are increasingly realizing that the speed that government moves at is far slower than the agility that they need to move at. So they are just cracking on and looking at this upskilling agenda and what are the tools that are available. There has been quite a lot more flexibility provided. I mentioned relaxing functional skills, relaxing the time commitment that's required in 20% off the job. So I think the movement has been certainly in apprenticeships, kind of pulling forward some of the things that Skills England talked about in terms of the flexibility required for employers.
Yeah, agreed. It's just that flexibility is a double-edged sword, isn't it? I know I was saying when the levy first came into being that, of course, employers were like maximum flexibility, but under the old regime, there was fraud in the old system. We can't call anything else but that. So there has to be an element of when, government money expenditures involved, or I know it starts off as employers' money. The that there has to be some structure around it. So I think part of it is working out where that balance should be, so the right flexibility. And I agree. I think that delay, I know I've heard lots of frustrated voices. I suspect that actually the once actually, and we've seen this with the level 7 announcements, actually once the Labour government got into power and lifted the hood, it's like, oh, this is more complex than we thought. And now we've actually started talking to employers, we realise the implications of it. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it happens over the coming months.
Yeah,
I
I've
was
got
interested, Jim. Sorry,
go
on
on.
one of the questions because you were talking about that bit around, because it is of course just England, the 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 levy. Do you find that actually with the stuff you were talking about, that as long as the core program is good, actually whether it's levy funded or not, the levy, I wouldn't say becomes irrelevant, but it's about whether actually that quality of program is being delivered. That's the key thing.
Yeah, absolutely right. Average doesn't get you anywhere, and employers know that. And certainly the 300 or so employers that you work with, they are looking for world-class programs, not to do something on the cheap. I guess that was my point. Just because it's free, that's not good enough. So if they can find apprenticeship programs that are fit and meet the needs for the skills agenda that they've got, and they can customize it and make it feel very aligned to the business outcomes that they want to be able to report on and achieve, then it's a huge bonus that it's funded partially through the levy in some cases. But you're absolutely right. When we work with employers, they want it to be a universal provision for all of their emerging talent, indeed for their global talent. So we develop a lot of programs for employers, and the England element is funded through the Levy, but then globally, all of their other colleagues, whether it's the emerging talent or aspiring managers or new managers or existing managers, go on the program and are funded commercially. And the benefit of that is you're providing consistency. You can customize it to different requirements in different geographies. The time commitment falls away outside England, so that's a consideration if you want to have universal provision. Do you want to make sure that outside England it's the same level of time commitment for consistency? But that's a conversation that we have with employers. I've got a final question for you, Stephen, which is you were talking about employers developing a strategic workforce plan for emerging talent, which essentially, I think, seemed to mirror what I was saying. We get asked to help create a business plan. Can I just drill into that? How important is that becoming with your employers, that strategic workforce plan?
I think it's becoming more important. I think the tricky thing is nobody knows how to do it properly yet. That's
Mm,
that's my sense. And it's interesting, part of my job, I do get to see what's happening in other parts of the world. And some of the most interesting stuff I've seen presented has been some organizations operating in Australia. And it's that really, how do you think about demographics, that stuff we've been talking about. Be interesting to see how data and mass labor market data starts to play into what some organizations are doing. It's really hard, I think, to find best practice. I am starting to hear from some organizations that are building analytics teams into TA functions to do this. I had a conversation really where it was an organization in the finance sector talked about where they were going to open up a certain office in a certain location because they knew one of the competitors were there. So they thought, oh, there must be lots of that talent there. And actually, once they did the actual mapping, they realized, no, their competitor, they had the only talent there was. So the only way that office would work is if they managed to, poach everybody. So yeah, I think it's very much it's moving from strategic or workforce planning in the past has often been quite operational. It's who do we need
mm,
on what job over the next 12 months, or
yeah.
how much hiring do we need to do? And I think it's people are working out how to actually think longer term. And again, one of the challenges I hear back is actually line managers are focused on delivering results now on the next 6 months. So actually
Yeah.
trying to get people just give them the headspace to think 2 or 3 years down the line is tricky. So I think it's an
Yeah.
emerging piece of work. And I'm just hearing it come onto the agenda more, and we're finding more people, asking us, oh, can we get into conversation with people who are doing it? Where's the best practice? It's trying to uncover that at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, look, we'll have to draw it to a close. I have to say, Stephen, I could chat and chat to yourself about this, but I love the collaboration that we have between Future Talent Learning and institute student employers. I think it's really important that we're all kind of sharing information so that we can navigate through this changing workplace landscape. And as I said, we're very happy to work with employers and help them kind of gratis put together a strategic, whether it's workforce plan or business case for aligning their skill strategy with what the business is looking to achieve. So we'll share the slides, and if there's anybody that's watching this on catch up, then please do be in touch. I'm Jim Carrick-Birtwell, jim@futuretalentlearning.com, and we'll share the slides. And we'd love to support you to kind of upskill at scale across your landscapes. Stephen, have a good rest of the day, and I look forward to chatting again soon.
And you, Jim, thanks for inviting me. Really
Yeah,
enjoyed it.
thanks everybody. Yeah, and thanks everybody for joining today. That's been a really helpful discussion. Bye for now.